Callum Hayes had not wanted to attend this reception. He'd made that extremely clear to Professor Martin when she'd insisted he needed to show his face at least one major diplomatic event during the academic conference. Callum was a xenoarchaeologist. He specialized in pre-contact civilizations, spent most of his time carefully excavating ancient ruins and trying to piece together how species long dead had understood their universe. He was comfortable with artifacts and dirt and the patient work of reconstruction. He was definitively not comfortable with formal receptions where everyone seemed to know complex social rules he'd never learned, and where his borrowed formal attire fit badly enough that he felt like a child wearing his father's clothes. But funding for their excavation site depended partly on visibility and political goodwill, and Professor Martin had been very clear that visibility meant actually being visible at events where important people gathered, not hiding in hotel rooms analyzing pottery shards. So Callum found himself at an elaborate state reception hosted by the Serathi royal family, standing near a refreshment table trying to look like he belonged, while actually calculating the minimum time required before he could reasonably escape without damaging the research team's funding prospects. The Serathi were an elegant species, their civilization ancient and sophisticated in ways that made human diplomatic protocols look like kindergarten social dynamics by comparison. Their elongated ears were famous throughout the Allied systems, not just for their distinctive appearance, but for their expressiveness, capable of communicating complex emotional states through subtle movements that took years of study to properly interpret. Their formal court interactions followed rules so intricate that entire academic departments existed just to study Serathi diplomatic traditions and social hierarchies. Callum had read exactly one briefing document about Serathi protocol before this event, which he now realized was approximately 1% of what he probably needed to know. The room was filled with nobility and high-ranking officials whose jewelry and formal attire communicated status in ways he couldn't begin to decode. Conversations flowed around him in multiple languages, translation implants rendering them into his native English, but keeping the formal register that made every exchange sound like carefully rehearsed performance. He felt completely, utterly out of place. Callum edged toward the refreshment table, figuring that holding a drink would at least give him something to do with his hands. The offerings were elaborate. Beverages in colors that shouldn't exist in nature, small, carefully arranged food items that looked almost too beautiful to eat. Everything presented with the kind of aesthetic precision that suggested eating was almost secondary to visual appreciation. He was studying a particularly geometric arrangement of something that might be fruit when he made the mistake of looking up and making eye contact with someone across the room. Princess Nivara. He recognized her from the welcoming ceremony that morning. The youngest daughter of King Torven, maybe 20 years old by human standards if he was translating Serathi aging correctly. She stood with her father and several high-ranking court officials, her formal robes elegant but somehow less elaborate than the others around her, suggesting perhaps that even among royalty there were gradations of formality he didn't understand. Her ears were positioned in what Callum's limited knowledge suggested was polite boredom, the Serathi equivalent of maintaining proper expression during tedious obligations. She caught him staring. Proper protocol, what little he remembered from the briefing, probably demanded he look away immediately, acknowledge the hierarchy by not presuming eye contact with royalty. Instead, Callum did what he'd do if he caught someone's eye at any gathering where both parties looked equally trapped by social obligation. He smiled, just a friendly, sympathetic, genuine smile. The universal expression of, "We're both stuck here at this formal thing, aren't we?" Princess Nivara's ears twitched. Callum couldn't interpret the movement precisely, but it seemed like surprise or possibly interest. Then she did something that made Callum's already uncomfortable evening take a turn toward the genuinely surreal. She leaned close to her father, whispered something quiet and quick, her mouth barely moving, the kind of intimate aside that suggested comfortable family relationship rather than formal court communication. King Torven's expression didn't change. His face maintained the same serene authority it had shown all evening. But his eyes shifted toward Callum with sudden sharp assessment, the kind of look that made Callum acutely aware he was being evaluated by one of the most powerful individuals in this sector of space. Then Princess Nivara whispered something else, still keeping her voice low enough that no one else could hear, and the king's ears moved in a complex pattern Callum definitely couldn't interpret. Around them, several court officials had noticed the exchange. Their conversations continued, but something in the atmosphere changed, became more watchful, more careful, like everyone was suddenly paying attention to something important while pretending not to notice it at all. Callum looked away quickly, his face heating with embarrassment. He'd clearly violated some protocol he didn't know about. The smile had been inappropriate somehow, or maybe staring at royalty was forbidden, or possibly both. He should leave. He should definitely leave. But Professor Martin had made him promise to stay at least 2 hours, and he'd barely been here 40 minutes. If he left now, she'd be furious, and their funding would probably suffer and… "That's interesting," someone said beside him. "The princess usually doesn't take such immediate interest in conference attendees." Callum turned to find a Serathi noble standing nearby, middle-aged by the silver threading through the darker tones of his ears, wearing formal robes with subtle patterns that probably indicated rank Callum couldn't decode. The noble was watching Princess Nivara with an expression that seemed more curious than concerned. "I think I accidentally did something wrong," Callum admitted, figuring honesty was probably his best strategy when he had no idea what the rules were. "I don't really know Serathi court protocols. I'm just here because my research partner insisted I attend at least one diplomatic event for funding visibility purposes." "And what do you research?" the noble asked, seeming genuinely interested. "Pre-contact civilizations. Specifically, I've been working on a site in the outer reaches that shows evidence of interstellar communication before any known species achieved faster-than-light travel. We think it might rewrite some assumptions about early contact periods." Callum realized he was rambling about work, which he always did when nervous. "Sorry, I tend to talk about ancient civilizations when I'm uncomfortable at formal events where I don't know anyone." The noble smiled. "Don't apologize. It's refreshing to hear someone discuss actual intellectual substance at these receptions rather than political positioning and social maneuvering. I'm Counselor Jevrin, by the way. I advise the king on academic and cultural matters." Callum Hayes, xenoarchaeologist, and probably very bad at court protocols. Callum hesitated, then decided to just ask directly, "Did I do something wrong when the princess and I made eye contact?" Counselor Jevrin's expression suggested he was trying not to laugh. "That depends on your intentions. In Serathi court culture, unsolicited eye contact with royalty followed by a smile can be interpreted in several ways. Most of them involve complex social implications." "I just smiled because she looked as bored as I felt," Callum said honestly. "It was just a friendly, sympathetic smile. I wasn't trying to communicate anything more complicated than formal receptions are tedious, aren't they?" "Yes," Jevrin said slowly. "I suspect she understood that, which is probably why she's currently discussing you with her father and will likely continue doing so throughout the evening. You've presented her with something she rarely encounters." "A protocol violation," Callum guessed. "Genuine human friendliness that doesn't know enough about our culture to perform political calculation," Jevrin corrected. "That's quite rare in her experience." Before Callum could figure out what that meant, a server approached with a tray of beverages. The drinks were beautiful, luminescent blue in crystal glasses that seemed to capture and refract light in impossible ways. Callum accepted one because refusing seemed potentially rude, though he had no idea if accepting was also rude in some way he didn't understand. He took a careful sip. The beverage tasted like honey mixed with something floral he couldn't identify, with an underlying complexity that suggested expensive and rare. It was possibly the best thing he'd ever tasted, which made him immediately suspicious about whether he was supposed to be drinking it. "That's Serathi Royal Vintage," Counselor Jevrin observed. "Generally reserved for family and specifically honored guests. They don't usually serve it at general receptions. In fact, I'm fairly certain it wasn't on the service list for tonight's event at all." Callum stared at the glass in his hand with growing alarm. "Should I not be drinking this? Is this another protocol violation? Should I?" "Oh, you should definitely drink it," Jevrin said, clearly amused now. "The question isn't whether you should. The question is why the royal household staff is serving it specifically to you. That's an interesting development. Across the room, Princess Nivara glanced toward Callum again, caught him looking, and her ears moved in what even Callum's untrained eye could recognize as barely suppressed amusement. Then she leaned toward her father once more, whispered something, and several nearby court officials suddenly found reasons to look in Callum's direction with renewed interest. Callum took another sip of the royal vintage and wondered if it was possible to accidentally cause a diplomatic incident just by being friendly at the wrong moment. Based on the increasingly complex pattern of glances and whispers spreading through the reception hall, he suspected the answer might be yes. This was going to be a very long evening. The reception continued, and Callum's discomfort evolved from simple social awkwardness into something more like being the unwitting subject of a study he hadn't consented to participate in. He tried to focus on conversations with other academics. There were several at the reception, scholars invited to present research during the conference, but he kept catching glimpses of Princess Nivara in his peripheral vision. Not staring exactly, just looking, brief glances that might mean nothing, followed by whispered comments to whoever stood nearest. Her father, court advisors, other members of what appeared to be the extended royal family. Each time she whispered, the person she spoke to would glance at Callum with expressions ranging from curiosity to calculation to what might be concern. Then they'd whisper to someone else, and the pattern would spread like some kind of social contagion. Within an hour, Callum was certain that half the nobility in the reception hall were aware of him in ways that had nothing to do with his archaeological research. "You're causing quite a stir," Professor Martin observed when she finally found him hiding behind a decorative column. She looked amused rather than concerned, which Callum found distinctly unhelpful. "I've had 3 separate nobles ask me about your family connections and political affiliations." "I don't have any," Callum said. "I'm a researcher. I spend my days excavating ancient trash heaps and trying to figure out what dead civilizations ate for breakfast." "Why would anyone care about my political connections?" "Because Princess Nivara keeps looking at you and whispering things to her father, which has apparently convinced half the court that you're either incredibly important or incredibly dangerous. Possibly both." Martin grinned. "What did you do to get the princess's attention?" "I smiled at her," Callum said miserably. "Earlier, when we made eye contact, I just smiled, like a friendly person would smile at another person who looked bored at a formal event. Apparently, that was wrong somehow." Martin's expression shifted from amusement to something closer to alarm. "You smiled at her? An unsolicited smile? Direct eye contact followed by a smile without formal introduction." "Yes, is that bad?" "How bad is that?" "In Serathi court protocol," Martin said carefully, "unsolicited smiling at royalty is considered either a severe breach of propriety suggesting inappropriate familiarity, or—" She paused. "Or what?" "Or a formal declaration of romantic interest. Depending on context and intention, which court observers would spend considerable time analyzing to determine which interpretation applies." Callum felt the blood drain from his face. Oh no, no, that's not what I meant at all. I was just being friendly. I didn't know, I wasn't. Oh God, does she think I was hitting on her? Does her father think I was inappropriately pursuing his daughter?" "I don't know what they think," Martin admitted. "But you've definitely gotten their attention. The question is what happens next." What happened next? After another excruciating 40 minutes of being surreptitiously observed while pretending not to notice, was that Callum made a decision that Professor Martin would later describe as either admirably direct or catastrophically stupid, depending on how charitable she felt at the moment. He walked directly across the reception hall, weaving through clusters of nobility engaged in carefully orchestrated conversations, and approached the small group surrounding King Torven and Princess Nivara. Several advisors noticed his approach and positioned themselves protectively, but Callum was committed now. He stopped at what he hoped was a respectful distance and addressed the group with as much formal courtesy as he could manage given that he had almost no idea what he was doing. "Excuse me, Your Majesty, Your Highness," he said, hoping he'd gotten the titles right. "I apologize for the interruption, but I need to address something directly because I'm starting to worry I've accidentally caused a significant cultural misunderstanding." The advisors looked scandalized. Approaching royalty without formal invitation violated at least a dozen protocols Callum hadn't read about. But King Torven raised one hand slightly, a gesture that seemed to mean, wait, and the advisors fell silent. Speak, the king said, his voice deep and measured, carrying authority that made Callum's diplomatic inexperience feel even more acute. My name is Callum Hayes. I'm a xenoarchaeologist attending the academic conference. Earlier this evening, I made eye contact with Princess Nivara and smiled. He addressed this next part directly to the princess, figuring honesty was his only viable strategy. It was a friendly smile, not a court gesture, not a political statement. Just person-to-person acknowledgement that we both looked equally trapped by formal obligations. I've since learned that in Serathi culture, that smile might have been interpreted as inappropriate familiarity or even romantic interest, and I want to be absolutely clear that I wasn't performing any kind of formal courtship gesture. I didn't know the protocols. I was just being friendly in the human way, which apparently doesn't translate well to your cultural context, and I'm very sorry if I caused offense or awkwardness. The silence that followed felt like it lasted for several years. Then Princess Nivara laughed, a genuine, delighted sound that made her ears express what even Callum could recognize as joy. Several advisors looked shocked by her reaction. I know, Nivara said, still smiling. Your face when you smiled made it very clear you weren't performing formal gesture. You looked surprised that I caught you looking. You weren't calculating political advantage or displaying courtship intention. You were just. She paused, searching for words, being friendly, like people are friendly when they're not performing for courts and politics. My advisors, King Torven said dryly, have spent the last hour and a half trying to determine your family lineage, political connections, and strategic value, because they assumed your smile represented a calculated attempt to court my daughter, which would normally require extensive preliminary negotiations involving both families and formal presentation of credentials and intentions. You've caused considerable confusion by being genuinely friendly without agenda. I'm very sorry, Callum said again, feeling his face heat with embarrassment. I can leave if... No, Nivara interrupted. Don't leave, please. King Torven looked at his daughter with an expression that combined paternal concern with recognition of something significant. Nivara. Father, he smiled at me like I was a person, Nivara said, her voice quiet but intense enough that Callum barely caught the words. Not a princess, not a political asset, not a strategic alliance opportunity, just someone who looked as uncomfortable at a formal reception as he felt. When was the last time anyone did that? When was the last time anyone looked at me and saw just me? The king's ears moved in a complex pattern that Callum still couldn't interpret, but that seemed to convey understanding mixed with resignation. He regarded Callum with assessment that felt simultaneous. What followed was perhaps the most unusual hour of King Torven's 40-year reign, and definitely the strangest evening of Callum's entire life. Rather than dismissing him or allowing the awkward moment to pass with formal courtesies, Princess Nivara made it clear, through a series of whispered conversations with her father that Callum wasn't quite close enough to hear, but could see happening, that she wanted to actually talk with the oblivious human xenoarchaeologist who'd smiled at her without knowing who she was. This is unprecedented, one of the king's advisors murmured, quiet but not quite quiet enough. The protocols for courtship introduction require. This isn't courtship, Nivara said firmly, her ears expressing determination even Callum could recognize. This is just conversation. Two people talking. That shouldn't require protocols and formal negotiations. Your Highness, every interaction with royalty carries political implications. Then maybe, Nivara interrupted, we've made everything too political. Maybe sometimes things can just be simple. King Torven looked at his daughter with an expression that suggested he was having some kind of internal debate between parental protectiveness, political wisdom, and recognition that his daughter had a point. Finally, he made a gesture that seemed to mean something significant to the surrounding advisors, because several of them stepped back to create a more private space within the crowded reception hall. Dr. Hayes, the king said, my daughter would like to speak with you, not as princess to subject, not through formal diplomatic protocols, just conversation, as people. I'm told this is common in human social interaction, though somewhat rare in our court traditions. Very common, Callum confirmed, trying to project competence despite feeling completely out of his depth. Humans talk to each other all the time without formal protocols. It's actually kind of our default mode. We're terrible at formality, honestly. I've noticed, the king said dryly. He turned to Nivara. I'll be nearby if you need me. I'll be fine, father, Nivara said, her tone affectionate but slightly exasperated. I'm just talking to someone, not negotiating alliance or planning insurrection. The king withdrew to speak with his advisors. Though Callum noticed, he positioned himself close enough to maintain visual line of sight, protective but not overbearing. Meanwhile, Princess Nivara turned her full attention to Callum, and he realized that despite being roughly the same height, she had a presence that made her seem taller, more substantial. So, she said, her ears expressing what might be amusement, xenoarchaeology. Tell me about that. For the next 45 minutes, Callum did something he hadn't expected to do at a formal diplomatic reception. He had a genuine conversation. Nivara asked intelligent questions about his research, displayed actual interest in the ancient civilizations he studied, and shared observations about Serathi historical sites that Callum found fascinating. She was smart, obviously smart, the kind of intelligence that had probably been trained from birth in political analysis, but that also seemed to extend to genuine curiosity about how things worked and why. The pre-contact communication methods you're researching, she said at one point. Do you think they were trying to reach each other? Or just sending messages into the void hoping someone would hear? That's the question, isn't it? Callum said, warming to his favorite topic. Were they communicating with specific intent to reach others, or just expressing themselves into space and hoping? The archaeological evidence suggests intentional communication, but proving that requires understanding motivations from civilizations dead for millennia. It's like trying to understand why someone smiled. Was it calculation or just genuine friendliness? Intent matters, but intent is the hardest thing to prove from artifacts and ruins. Nivara's ears moved in what Callum was beginning to recognize as her tell for when something struck her as particularly insightful. You just compared archaeological interpretation to court politics, she observed. That's either very clever or accidentally appropriate. Probably accidentally appropriate, Callum admitted. Most of my clever insights are accidents. I just care a lot about dead civilizations, and sometimes that produces observations that sound smarter than I actually am. I doubt that, Nivara said. Then, quieter, you know, I've had hundreds of conversations at events like this. People approach me constantly. Nobles, diplomats, potential suitors from families seeking alliance. They're all very polite, very formal, very carefully calculated to make good impressions and position themselves advantageously. But you're the first person in years who's just talked to me about things that interest you, without performing for approval or calculating political benefit. That's because I didn't know who you were when I smiled, Callum said honestly. If I'd known you were the princess, I probably would have avoided eye contact entirely and spent the evening hiding behind decorative columns, which I was doing anyway, actually, the hiding part. Nivara laughed again, that same genuine sound that seemed to surprise the court observers who were definitely still watching despite pretending not to. And now that you know who I am, are you performing, calculating? Callum considered the question seriously. No, he said finally. I'm still too confused about protocols to effectively perform anything. I'm just trying to have a conversation without accidentally causing more diplomatic incidents. If I start calculating political advantage, I'll let you know, but honestly, I don't think I'm capable of that level of social sophistication. I barely manage normal human social situations. Add in court protocols and alien cultural norms, and I'm completely lost. Good, Nivara said quietly. Stay lost, it's refreshing. Across the room, King Torven watched this exchange with expressions that cycled through concern, resignation, and what might have been reluctant approval. Counselor Jevrin appeared beside him, following the king's gaze toward where his daughter conversed with the awkward human archaeologist. This is highly irregular, Your Majesty, Jevrin observed. Everything about this evening has been irregular, the king replied. My daughter whispered to me that someone smiled at her like she was just a person, not a princess, not a political asset, just someone trapped at a formal event. She asked me to let her talk with him properly. How do I respond to that? The protocols would suggest. The protocols, King Torven interrupted gently, were designed for political maneuvering and strategic alliance. They weren't designed for this. For someone who doesn't know our rules and therefore can't perform them, who looks at my daughter and just sees someone worth talking to. You're considering allowing this to continue, Jevrin said, not quite a question. I'm considering, the king said slowly, that perhaps some protocol violations are worth it if they lead to genuine connection. My daughter has endured years of formal courtship, attempts from noble houses seeking alliance. Smiled politely through countless calculated presentations. She's never looked this engaged. This, happy. The court will have opinions, Jevrin warned. The court always has opinions, King Torven said. That's what courts do. But sometimes a father's judgment matters more than court consensus. And my judgment is that the human archaeologist who smiled at my daughter, without knowing who she was, might be exactly what she needs, even if it violates every protocol we've established. Jevrin's ears moved in acknowledgement. Then, I suppose we'll need to determine how to manage the unprecedented situation of a princess developing genuine interest in someone who holds no rank, offers no political advantage, and doesn't know our protocols well enough to properly court her. Yes, the king agreed. That does seem to be the situation we're navigating. Any suggestions? Improvise, Jevrin offered. That seems to be what Dr. Hayes is doing, and it appears to be working remarkably well. King Torven made a sound that might have been a laugh. Improvisation, in Serathi court politics, my advisors will be horrified. Probably, Jevrin agreed, but look at your daughter's ears. When was the last time you saw her that relaxed at a formal event? The king looked, and his own ears expressed something that might have been paternal affection mixed with resignation to the inevitable. Point taken. Let's see where this impossible situation leads. Over the following weeks, as Callum continued his research work on Serath Prime and prepared his presentation for the academic conference, something unexpected developed. He and Princess Nivara became friends. Not through formal courtship protocols, those clearly didn't apply too. Someone who'd accidentally stumbled into royal attention through sheer cultural ignorance. Just friends, people who genuinely enjoyed talking with each other. Nivara visited his excavation site twice, genuinely interested in the ancient communication arrays he was studying and asking questions that demonstrated real understanding of archaeological methodology. Callum attended several court functions with her, still uncomfortable with formal protocols, but gradually learning to navigate them with the kind of awkward directness that somehow worked precisely because he wasn't trying to perform political sophistication. They talked about ancient civilizations and current politics, about the burden of expectation and the freedom of obscurity, about what it meant to be seen as yourself versus being seen as your role or position, about how sometimes a simple smile could communicate more genuine connection than months of formal diplomatic exchange. The court observers continued their whispered conversations, trying to categorize this unprecedented relationship into frameworks they understood. Some dismissed it as temporary fascination that would fade once the novelty wore off. Others viewed it as strategic maneuvering from the human side, though they couldn't determine what Callum's angle was since he clearly held no political ambitions and seemed genuinely confused about basic court dynamics. A few, mostly the older, more experienced courtiers, recognized it for what it actually was. Two people who enjoyed each other's company despite, or perhaps, because of their completely different backgrounds and social positions. King Torven watched with the complex feelings of a father seeing his daughter happy, while also managing an entire kingdom's political implications. He had several private conversations with Callum that walked the delicate line between paternal protectiveness and political necessity. You understand, the king said during one such conversation, that my daughter's friendships carry political weight whether either of you intends that or not. People will interpret this, draw conclusions, make assumptions. I understand, Callum said, though he looked uncomfortable with the entire concept. I'm not trying to cause problems. If my friendship with Nivara creates complications for her, or for you, I can. You can continue being yourself, the king interrupted. That's what makes this valuable. The moment you start calculating political advantage or performing for court approval, you become like everyone else she knows. The genuine connection is worth the political complications. I'm simply making you aware they exist. They exist, Callum confirmed. Professor Martin gives me a briefing every morning about which noble houses are angry about my access to the princess, and which are trying to determine if they can use me as a backdoor to royal influence. It's simultaneously flattering and terrifying. Welcome to court politics, the king said dryly. Now imagine living with it your entire life. I'd probably hide in ancient ruins and dig up other people's garbage rather than deal with it, Callum said. Yes, the king agreed. I suspect you would, which is perhaps why my daughter finds you so refreshing. The breakthrough moment came 6 months after that initial reception, when Callum presented his research findings to the Royal Academy of Sciences. It was a significant venue. The Academy was one of the most prestigious scientific institutions in the Allied systems, and presenting there represented major recognition for his work on pre-contact civilizations. Princess Nivara attended, sitting in the royal box reserved for the king and his family. Callum spotted her as he was being introduced, and for a moment the old discomfort returned, the awareness of being watched by someone important, the fear of disappointing expectations, the weight of significance he hadn't asked for. Then he caught her eye, and without thinking about court protocols or political implications or what observers might interpret, he smiled. The same friendly, genuine smile he'd given at that first reception. The smile that had accidentally violated protocols and started this entire complicated friendship. Nivara's ears expressed joy so clearly that even the least experienced human in the audience could have read it. She smiled back, just as genuine, just as free of calculation. And Callum relaxed. Because however complicated the political implications might be, however much the court observers might whisper and analyze and draw conclusions, the core of it was simple. He'd smiled at someone who looked like they needed a friendly face, and she'd recognized that friendliness for what it was. Everything else was just details. His presentation went well. He spoke about ancient communication with the passion of someone who genuinely loved his work, and the Academy scholars responded with the kind of engaged questions that made for productive academic discussion. When it was over and the traditional acknowledgments were being made, King Torven stood from his seat in the royal box, a gesture that commanded immediate attention and silence. "Dr. Hayes," the king said formally, his voice carrying through the lecture hall, "your research demonstrates the kind of intellectual rigor and genuine curiosity that advances our understanding of the universe. But more than that, it reminds us that communication across vast distances and different cultures requires more than technology or protocol. It requires willingness to see others as people worth understanding, even when we don't share their frameworks or know their rules." The king paused, and Callum could swear he saw the faintest hint of amusement in the monarch's expression. Sometimes the most important discoveries come not from following established procedures, but from approaching situations with genuine interest and open honesty. Especially when, that means occasionally violating protocols through sheer ignorance of what they are. Several scholars laughed. The king's ears expressed satisfaction. And Princess Nivara, still sitting in the royal box, looked at her father with an expression that suggested she understood exactly what he was really saying beneath the formal acknowledgement of academic work. After the presentation, during the reception where attendees congratulated Callum and discussed his findings, Nivara found him in a quieter corner where he'd retreated to catch his breath. "You smiled at me," she observed. "Yes," Callum confirmed. "Same smile as 6 months ago, still just friendly, still not performing formal gesture. I'm remarkably consistent in my diplomatic incompetence." "It's not incompetence," Nivara said quietly. "It's honesty. You smile at me the same way whether we're alone or in front of the entire Royal Academy. You talk to me the same way whether my father is listening or not. You've never performed for advantage, never calculated for political benefit, just been yourself." "I don't really know how to be anything else," Callum admitted. "I'm sure I could learn to perform properly if I studied court protocols seriously, but I'd probably be terrible at it and the effort would make me miserable. Better to just be honestly awkward and hope people appreciate the transparency." "I appreciate it," Nivara said, "more than you know." Around them, court observers were definitely watching this conversation, definitely whispering to each other, definitely drawing conclusions and making interpretations. But Callum had learned over the past 6 months that he couldn't control what people thought or what political implications they read into simple friendship. He could only control his own intentions and actions, so he smiled at Nivara, friendly, genuine, uncomplicated by calculation, and she smiled back the same way. And whatever the court made of that, whatever political analysis they applied to a human archaeologist and a Serathi princess being friends across vast differences in rank and culture, the core of it remained simple and real. Sometimes a smile is just a smile. And sometimes that's exactly what someone needs, to be seen as a person rather than a position, to be valued for themselves rather than what they represent, to connect with someone who doesn't know the protocols well enough to perform them, and who treats you like you're just another person worth knowing. 6 months after Callum Hayes accidentally caused a diplomatic incident by smiling at a princess, he stood in the Royal Academy reception hall, having somehow become friends with royalty despite violating every protocol designed to govern such relationships. It shouldn't have worked. By all reasonable analysis, it should have ended in embarrassment or scandal or quiet dismissal. But sometimes the most important connections are the ones that ignore reasonable analysis and happen anyway, built on nothing more strategic than a smile that says, "You look as uncomfortable as I feel," and a response that recognizes genuine friendliness when it appears. King Torven, watching from across the room as his daughter conversed with the awkward human who'd smiled at her without knowing who she was, allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. Sometimes protocol violations led to exactly what was needed. Sometimes the best diplomatic breakthrough came from someone who didn't know the rules. And sometimes a father's job was simply to create space for his daughter to be seen as a person, even if that meant rewriting centuries of tradition to accommodate a xenoarchaeologist who smiled at princesses like they were just other people stuck at